Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the November meeting of the Gene Winter Northeast Chapter of the Mass Archaeological Society. I'm Victor Mastone. I'm the chapter chairman. I'm also the president of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. The Mass Archaeological Society's annual meeting is Saturday, December 3rd. Members, and anyone's actually welcome. It will include a lecture by Wampanoag educator Linda Coombs. She's going to talk about the way of wampum. We tend to have such general ideas about it. She's really going to get to how it's valuable to their society traditionally, as well as Darius Coombs is going to come and do a demo, and you'll be able to make your own shell pendant that day as well. So it's sort of a little activity. The next meeting of the chapter will be a week earlier, December 13th. Naomi Ritterford, I believe, is our scheduled speaker. I could not find my schedule, my apologies, but that was the recollection of that. I have really no other announcements to make regarding the chapter, except probably in the spring, we're going to have a business meeting because we need to actually update our bylaws. There's a few errors in it that need to be rectified, and it has to be done by the chapter membership. So with that, I'm going to go right to our speaker. And here we go. Since I type everything so small, I can't read anything. But our speaker tonight is Art Clausnitzer. Yeah, I got it right. He's a local personality in the sense that he grew up in this area and now lives in this area. He got his undergraduate degree from the University of Southern Maine, one of Nate Hamilton's students, I guess we'd have to say. So Nate has done us all service. He got his master's and PhD from Memorial University in Canada. He did his MA thesis on I think it's quite an interesting topic, which we'll have to get him to come back to talk about, is a brew house from 1622 in Newfoundland. And not often that we get that kind of a topic, which really ties into archaeologists because we all seem to like beer. Tonight, he's going to be speaking about his case study and history of Smuttynose Island in Maine. He's going to be comparing, it's a sort of to me, nice because it's both archaeology and maritime history, and it ties into fisheries, which is one of my areas of personal interest. And no, I did not ask him to be the speaker tonight. Lindsay is responsible, so he gets the accolades. With that, I'm going to just have Art come right up and get right to it. Don't look so excited, Art. I know it's a tough audience. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. So topic of tonight's paper came out of my larger dissertation and research into the 17th century fisheries, which I had while I was at Memorial University of Newfoundland. After procrastinating half a decade, having raised a daughter of my own kind of does that too, I decided it was finally time to start talking about some of this work I've done, and hopefully you'll learn something new from this. So as was mentioned today, this is going to not work for me right now. The remote's not working. It's not in this fashion. That's it's it was address. Right. Today I'm focused on the Isles of Shoals, which is this tiny archipelago of glorified rocks just offshore Portsmouth. You can see kind of a blown up map here. I had the good fortune of being a field supervisor and teaching assistant for a field school that was run out there. I was there for 4 of the 5 years the field school was run. It was run by Nate Hamilton through the Shoals Marine Lab. And we were primarily focused on Smuttynose Island, which you can see here in the old Coast Guard Tower on Appledore Island. Also, we uncovered, I believe it was several thousand, maybe approaching as many as 10,000 artifacts from about 5,000 years of human history, which you can see a small sample of on the screen of, some Lavana Point here, I believe that's what that's called. It's been a while since I've had a look at the prehistoric stuff, it's a little rusty. We got an old US coin. This is called the Jonah pipe. And then of course we have, beer bottle with the Haley House on it, which is on Smuttynose Island. My specific interest for this paper, at least, is a rather indistinct structure that we uncovered in 2009 and 2010. At the time, we thought the structure may have been a cavern, but in the years since, I've done a lot more research in the history of the island, and especially the legal history of the island. And I have come to believe that the structure that we found was not a tavern, but was actually a meeting house. Specifically, a meeting house that was probably built around 1650 and was in disuse by around 1685. But the artifacts tell us that besides the traditional meeting house applications, it was actually, fulfilling a secular and spiritual role. It was also used as a place of business, fulfilling what you could almost say is kind of a profane role in the community. And I'll explain a little bit more later. The Isles of Shoals are a place of lore and legend in the local communities, which occasionally serves to obscure the true history of the islands. One of my particular favorite stories is that Blackbeard the pirate, who's on screen right now, abandoned one of his wives on the island after he was forced to flee from a British patrol. Unfortunately, at least the version of the story I'm most familiar with, which was published in a book called Finding New England Shipwrecks and Treasures, says that this happened in 1720. But anyone who knows the actual history I ever teach knows that he was killed off in North Carolina in 1718. Still, you should never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Other popular bits of Shoals folklore being that there was a population of 300 fishermen on the island in 1623. There wasn't. There wasn't. And that John Smith of Virginia fame, which you can see his famous map in New England, including Smith's Isles, which is what he called the Isles of Shoals. He was known for naming things after himself. Claimed that he wanted to put a colony of those islands, but he actually didn't. In fact, when the Council of New England divided up the region, they gave him Smith Isles. That was all they gave him. And his response, which you can see on the screen, was, "There was no lot for me but Smith's Isles, which are an array of barren rocks, most overgrown with shrubs and sharp winds that you can hardly pass them, but either grass or wood, but 3 or 4 short, shrubby cedars." So he didn't like the islands. He thought they were good for fishing, but he didn't actually want them. The actual history of the early European occupations of shoals is tied almost exclusively to one product, the codfish. Volumes have been written about the quality and value of the dry fish made at the shoals. Again, a large part of those stories is folklore, though by the 19th century, shoals dunfish was considered a delicacy in high demand by dignitaries such as Thomas Jefferson. In the 17th century, however, the shoals was considered producing conventional salt cod products from fishing stations, which may have resembled this one in Newfoundland. The cod fisheries tied the Isles of Shoals into several trade networks, which carried products from New England to destinations in the Chesapeake, Caribbean, English, and European markets. Best quality fish went to the Iberian Peninsula, where it was in high demand for both religious and secular purposes. Most famously, to quote Peter Pope, this trade turned fish into wine. However, it also turned fish into wool, which fed English textile industries, transmuted into other foodstuffs, which cannot be produced in England or the colonies, and was used to acquire manufactured goods for later resale, both in the British Isles and in the colonies. The worst quality fish, which was termed refuse fish, was sent to the Caribbean as cheap nutrition for slaves in the sugar plantations, as this quote from a letter from Richard Bynes and John Winthrop illustrates. These voyages also would call into the Chesapeake, where they acquired tobacco and other plantation products, and usually carried other New England products, such as forestry products, south with them to sell in those ports as well. The Shoals fishermen were tied into these markets by merchants in the New England mainland. The most significant of these men were Ipswich merchants, such as Jonathan Wayne, Francis Wainwright, and Thomas Bishop, but Salem and ports it also provided connections to the transatlantic world. These connections played a role in the development of the social and economic structures in the Isles of Shoals, which I will discuss momentarily. There's been intermittent archaeological studies on the Isles of Shoals since at least the 1980s. The data used in this paper was recovered through the field schools that were run from 2008 to 2012. You can see students from the 2010 field school working on the excavation units related to the meetinghouse in Smuttynose Island. A later JPR survey suggests that the structure may have actually been much larger than originally thought. This image shows the results of that survey overlaid with an aerial photo of Smuttynose Island, and anomaly 4, which is right here, is situated in the right location and at the right depth to be the southern gable end structure that we were looking at. The excavation unit in the previous photo was actually set right about here, which in this photo is now the back dirt pile. Unfortunately, most of the structure has either been washed away or is buried beneath areas of dense vegetation, which from experience I can tell you we're never going to get something kind of illegal, I think. I previously mentioned that the structure was initially believed to be the remains of a tavern, which actually in the 17th century would be more properly termed an ordinary. In a vacuum, this interpretation is reasonable, especially when you look at the archaeological assemblage. The ceramic assemblage contained high proportions of vessels related to drinking and eating. Comparing these distribution of these vessel forms with those from the wealthy tavern down on the Cape and from St. John's Inn in Maryland shows broad similarities, which this chart shows you. You have Smuttynose Island, you have the Wellfleet Tavern, and you have St. John's Inn, and as you can see, it follows a roughly similar pattern. The site also shares characteristics with numerous 17th century planter sites, which is what they call the homes of colonists in Newfoundland, where vernacular hospitality industry served a migratory fishing fleet that led to planters establishing informal ordinaries in their own home to provide alcohol and tobacco and food products to those settlers. There's also evidence for other activities associated with taverns and ordinaries. This bone die here suggests that dice games and by extension gambling occurred at the site. The stamp lead token here most likely served as substitute currency, either due to the persistent lack of specie in the colonies or as a convenient way for a population with only a basic numeracy to easily make purchases of this particular establishment. We know from the ceramic assemblage that they were serving food, but we also found the spoon, which just serves to reinforce that fact. And like most 17th century sites, tobacco pipes were both ubiquitous and numerous. While I was out there, nothing amused me as much as the lack of excitement from a first-year student after they found their 100th clay pipe fragment. Probably the only thing better than that would be when they found 10,000th nail, which there were many as well. This is just a small sample of the smoking pipe bowls recovered from the area of the structure, although some of these clearly predate its construction and are related to the earlier seasonal occupation of the site. Harrington histogram, which illustrates the relative intensity of use based on sim bore sizes, demonstrates that there was a steady increase in the use of this area of Smuttynose Island starting in the 1620s and peaking in the 1650s to the 1680s. However, it very precipitously drops off after about 1680 and is more or less abandoned. This simple observation provided a vital clue in establishing the identity of this structure, which I'll address thoroughly. I stated at the beginning of my talk that my interpretation of that is this structure is not a tavern or ordinary, but instead the original Shoals meeting house. By now you're probably wondering why I made this interpretation. The answer is deceptively simple. There's almost no support for the presence of a formal tavern or ordinary on Smuttynose Island. The historical, and I use that phrase rather lightly in this case, support for that interpretation comes from a single line in John Jennis's book, The Isles of Shoals, an historical sketch, where he writes that an ordinary or tavern was kept on Smuttynose, and he cites the York County records as evidence for this. What the York County records actually show is that the retailing of single servings of alcohol was illegal in the Isles of Shoals until about the middle of the 1660s. And starting in the 1650s, there are numerous violators of the statute who were fined and imprisoned and then fined again in a kind of a never-ending cycle. And even in the 1650s, 1660s, what we were seeing is a temporary license to be issued during what was called the weighing times, which is when merchants of the mainland would visit the islands with the intent of buying the fish that had been produced during the previous fishing seasons. And it was only after 1671 that a permanent ordinary was around the islands. And even then, there was a lot of evidence of illicit or illegal sales of alcohol amongst the fishermen there. So this created enough doubt in my mind for me to reject the ordinary or the tavern interpretation for the structure. So obviously the question is why do I think it's the Smuttynose Meetinghouse? Well, for much the same reason, I think that it's not the tavern, which is the historical records. For example, in 1685, the residents of the Shoals were fined by Massachusetts for failing to maintain a place of public meeting and worship, which means they didn't have a meeting house. Besides dovetailing nicely with the Pipeston data from the Harrington histogram, this also 1685, or that area seems to be when Samuel Belcher, the then minister on the Shoals, quits his residence there and returns to the mainland. And then 16 years later, in 1701, Star Island sued Smuttynose Island resident Roger Kelly in an attempt to reclaim the bell from the original meeting house, which they believed was in his possession. As to why I think this particular structure is a meeting house, I have the 1661 deed from Edmund Pickard, who states his flake room is against the meeting house at Smuttynose Island and is located between the stages of Walter Matthews and Stephen Ford. This specific wording would situate the meeting house relatively close to the water, as stages of the platforms from which fish is unloaded and processed, and the flake room is the area used for drying the processed fish. Archaeological evidence also suggests there may have been a substantial brick structure to the structure, and fragments of glazed windows were recovered from units nearby. Well, these are not unheard of on fisheries structures, homes, things like that. They are somewhat uncommon, and this suggests a relatively high amount of investment into this particular structure. As a significant public building, the meeting house would have seen such extra investment from the community. Meeting houses are often seen as a distinctly New England phenomenon, and in many ways the center of religious, political, and social life in the Puritan communities that dominated Massachusetts Bay and its offshoot colonies. These proto-congregationalist communities did not worship in church or attend mass, as that was symbolic of the perceived decadence of the Anglican and Catholic faiths. I have 3 examples of meeting houses that stand today up on the screen, including the Rocky House Meeting House in Amesbury, which is from the 1720s. The replica of the first Salem Meeting House, which is currently located in Danvers. And the Star Island Meeting House, which is out on the Isles of Shoals, which was originally built to replace the Cape Smuttynose structure. These communities, it was the meeting house that served a spiritual function as a place of worship. Throughout the Puritan sphere, the attendance of divine services was compulsory. However, meeting houses also served numerous secular functions, not least of which was the courthouse town hall. Meeting houses hosted community meetings, court dates, trials, and occasionally executions. To be used as an ordinary, even temporarily, seems to be unique to the Smuttynose Island meeting house. To understand why the meeting house would have acquired this other role as a ordinary place to serve alcohol, it is necessary to understand the socioeconomic organization of the Isles of Shoals, especially as it is often misrepresented in popular books and other works on the islands. Broadly speaking, the fisheries created 3 classes of participants. The first class are the merchants elite of Massachusetts Bay. These men controlled the capital, access to shipping, and the flow of goods into and out of the colony. The most important members of this class in the 17th century, at least as far as the Shoals are concerned, are Francis Wainwright, Jonathan Wade, and Thomas Bishop, all of Ipswich, which at the time was an important commercial harbor for Massachusetts. The fishing masters were the next class. These men were the Isles of Shoals residents who owned the fisheries infrastructure, such as shallops, which are the boats they fish from, stages, and flakes. Men of this class included William Steele, Walter Matthews, Roger Kelly, Hugh Allard, and Philip Babb, who incidentally was not a pirate as Celia Thaxter once claims. Popular history and folklore about the Isles of Shoals likes to portray these men as apostates, launching their independence from the mainland. While true to a small extent, they actually were largely dependent on the mainland merchants both for finances and to bring their products to market. The final class on the Isles of Shoals were the fishing servants, which were employees of the fishing masters who worked for either shares of the catch or for a flat rate. Two prominent names, mostly due to their repeated appearance in the court records from the Isles of Shoals, are Gabriel Grubb and William Harris. But there are also 9 men who perished at sea alongside Grubb in a winter storm in 1678. Of at least 7 were probably fishing servants. And obviously, there were more than that. Those are just the names. Primarily concerned with the relationship between the merchants and the fishing masters. The merchants controlled access to the transatlantic world, and the fishing masters controlled the means of production. This meant that the two groups needed to work with each other to fully exploit the cod stocks of the Gulf of Maine. This would not be an equal relationship, however. You can see on screen, the vast disparities in wealth between the two groups ensured this. Much greater wealth comes much greater political power, giving the merchants the advantage in any negotiations. This forced the fishing masters to utilize every bit of agency they possess when discussing terms and conditions for loans or lines of credit or whatever they needed to get them back for the next season. The relationship between the masters and merchants was most often referred to as a merchant-client relationship, which meant that the fishing masters would require supplies for each fishing season from the merchants on credit, either as a direct line or through mortgages on properties. In exchange, the masters promised to sell all the fish they made that season to that merchant. Any extras was there to spend. Fail to pay off the merchant or break the terms of the contract, and the fishing master could find himself in jail, as Smuttynose resident Hugh Allard discovered multiple times. Because of this, and the fact that a single season could make or break a fishing master, the Shoals residents sought the most favorable terms and the best price for their fish they could. The archaeology suggests that one of the strategies employed was the use of displays of conspicuous consumption. When negotiating with and entertaining the merchants and their agents. Higher status ceramics, such as the tin-glazed vessels that you see here and this Northern Italian slipper bowl, were common in the meetinghouse assemblage, as our vessels suggested of an individualized serving strategy. Credit date information, however, suggests that the masters themselves preferred pewter and or communal dining strategies when they were at their own homes. I interpreted this as evidence that the fishing masters were intending to use their knowledge of current fashions and trends to impress the merchants, in effect stating, I'm knowledgeable about and have the resources to spend on the best and most recent fashions. Obviously, I'm a good investment. The meetinghouse, as a relatively large public structure, would have been a perfect venue for negotiations between the masters and merchants, as well as the location for the temporary ordinary used to entertain these visitors. This would have resulted in a scene somewhat more sedate and a little less boisterous than this image. It was at one of these meetings in 1666 that the merchants and masters gathered to negotiate the price of fish. After some initial disagreements, a price was set. Unfortunately, the records indicate that neither party seems to have actually agreed on what that price was, because we have a pair of lawsuits between fishing master and Richard Endall and Ipswich merchant Jonathan Wade over the status of Endall's account. Basically, Endall was saying there was a higher price and he had balanced his account and Wade owed him money. Wade said no, it was a lower price and Endall owed him money. And in the end, the courts decided in the favor of Wade on both counts. But now for the really important question. Where did the Shoals fishing servants get drunk if the meetinghouse ordinary was only a seasonal part-time establishment? To be honest, probably wherever the hell they want. There's plenty of places in that island that this person could hide with a bottle and get drunk. However, that being said, the historical research of this paper does provide evidence for one discrete option, naming the house of fishing servant William Harris. William Harris was employed by fishing master William Seeley, and they seem to have had a good relationship, as Seeley sold Harris a small house in 1666, and following Harris's death 3 years later, Seeley confirmed that he did in fact own that house and that it had been sold to him. when Harris's estate was probated. Harris was one of the more successful fishing circuits in the Isles of Shoals Basin's probated wealth, with an estate worth 54 pounds at depth. Compare this to Gabriel Grubb, another long-term fishing servant at the Isles of Shoals, who worked for Roger Kelly of Smuttynose Island. Grubb died during the 1678 winter storm, leaving behind a wife and estate worth just over 21 pounds. How to explain the relative greatest success that Harris enjoyed? Harris's probate fails to list any fisheries infrastructures or even shitters in his own shallot, so he was definitely a fishing servant. What it does list, however, is a large amount of food and drink related goods, which you can see on the screen. Furthermore, his wife was fined for selling alcohol illegally in 1667. Perhaps the Harrises followed the Newfoundland hospitality model and operated an unlicensed tippling house. If so, this provided them with enough extra income that they were able to invest a relatively higher amount or a relatively greater amount of their wealth into creature comforts than Harris's employer, William Silly, who invested the majority of his wealth into the fisheries. Meetinghouses across the Puritan sphere already serve spiritual and secular roles in the community. The same structure would be a house of worship on Sunday and a courtroom on Monday, where the notoriously litigious Puritan society would attempt to resolve its social conflicts. The Smuttynose structure, being on the fringe of the Massachusetts-based sphere of influence, was unique in adopting another role by hosting meetings where money or credit was exchanged and food and drink were served. In some ways, this can be seen as a profane role, catering to the base desires of an island of fishermen and the avarice of mainland merchants. This contradiction is a reflection of the Shoals community at large. They were part of the larger New England community, but resembled the fishing communities in Newfoundland more so than the mercantile and agrarian communities in the Massachusetts-based sphere, but with elements that were unique to them in their own time and place. Thank you. These comments occasionally get death threats.
You mentioned a flake house being adjacent to the, what's a flake house?
Flakes are the platforms. They're a raised elevated structure that you use to dry the codfish, and they're traditionally referred to as rooms in the fisheries. You'd have a flake room, which is where your flakes were. You'd have a stage room, which is where your stage or the dock where you would moor your boats and process your fish would be. Occasionally you even see references to a train room, which is where the train vat, which is the giant tub where they threw cod livers in to let them rot so they could collect the oil out of it. It's just an older way of saying just a place kind of or a location. Yes.
Was the fishing a year-round occupation, or how did the cod run?
In Gulf of Maine, it was a year-round thing. The best fishing was said to take place in the winter. Because the cod would come close to the surface because the water temperature would be cooler. Cod is usually considered a cold water fish or a colder water fish, which was kind of the opposite of what you would see in Newfoundland, where it was a kind of a spring, summer, early fall season. And then during the winter, it was just too cold and you couldn't fish. But that's also why you see a lot more things like in 1678, I mentioned briefly, 10 net residents of the Isles of Shoals basically disappeared at sea in their boats.
The earliest image that we have of Shoals on a map.
Probably the 1616 map by John Smith. It was mentioned in Champlain's account of visiting the New England coast, albeit indirectly. He describes seeing a bunch of low rocks off to his port side, and based on the description of where he was, he just passed a cape and a headland. They think he was off of Cape Ann when he spotted them, kind of way off into the distance.
And when did the first European settlers develop something?
So that's harder to say. There were definitely fishermen on the island by 1623, and I have smoking pipe bowls that are as old as 1610. Like I only have one or two of those, and that's kind of an imprecise measurement. In terms of permanent settlements, a little harder to pin down because initially the Isles of Shoals fell under the control of the Council for New England, and then that was dissolved, a split between the province of Maine, which is Ferdinando Gorges, and the province of New Hampshire, which was John Mason. And that's the reason why the shoals are split right down the middle. is because the two of them didn't each wanted a piece of the Isles of Shoals because they're seen as a strategic location for fisheries. However, they probably weren't allowed to live on the islands at the time. They probably maintained a home. They were all employees. They'd probably be at a communal structure or a village on the mainland and would only go out during the fishing season. We do have evidence that actually women were banned from the island. And although a lot of people like to say, oh, that's because women were considered bad luck in sea voyages, it was actually probably part of a strategy to keep people from just living there. Because if you didn't have, your wife or your girlfriend, or whatever out there with you, you were less likely just to say, screw it, I'm staying here. You have to go back to the mainland.
How about native population?
We have prehistoric artifacts. I showed you some. We also have some pottery that we dug from like the very deepest recesses and some of the rocks we uncovered. We don't think there was an occupation out there. We think it was used primarily as a hunting camp. But we do have some calcined bone mixed in with the native stuff. Nothing that I believe was identifiable. But actually need Hamlin to know more about that because I focused primarily on the historical section. He is much more of a prehistoric items. Yes.
So the true was the economic factor for sentiment on decades or community.
It was very important for a very long period of time. And it was one of the reasons why New England was settled in the first place. Because it was beyond the fact that you had religious holidays where you weren't supposed to be eating meat, but you could eat fish. England actually had additional their fast days where you could not consume meat. And it was also seen as a strategic resource used to feed army and the navy. In fact, the Mary Rose, the British warship, this Tudor British warship they recovered from the Thames, actually had dried salt cod in it from Newfoundland. They recovered when they dug her up or lifted her out of the water.
I think they had some time out the fishing gangs, so. 14 hours catch cod by weighted baskets over the side, boats.
There's accounts that they could. Some of the earlier visitors, and even as late as the 1600s, said the cod were so thick that we just threw baskets over the side and just pulled them right out of the water. That probably wasn't a common way of fishing. And knowing some of the authors of some of these earlier accounts, they might have been exaggerating in order to attract more people over to New England and Newfoundland.
We have a question on the chat. Laura's asking about documents related to William Steele.
I don't have too many specifically about him. Most of what I have is from the published collections of main legal documents. So his probate inventory is in there. I do have one mortgage where he basically borrowed money from, I think it was Francis Wainwright, that was like 40 pounds, and basically said, I'm giving you this money, you're signing over your property to me. If you don't pay me back, I get to keep your property. Considering that was 5 or 6 years before he passed away, he obviously was able to repay that loan. I don't have too much other than that. Now, that being said, I haven't done too much research into the individual peoples besides trying to get names and kind of figure out the relationships between them.
You talked about the Harrington technique for dating the pipe stems, and some people might not be familiar with that. So maybe, and I think there are other techniques that people
there are a lot of other techniques. I personally am very skeptical about stemboard dating techniques, especially on these very earlier sites, because despite what Harrington method says that over time, the stem bore size, the diameter changes at a relatively steady rate. So you know that if you have a collection that has mostly size, say 7s, now this is off the cuff, so I don't actually remember what the specific things are. Those were most likely deposited between 1650 and 1680. So it provides a useful, if kind of vague indication of when a site was occupied. However, on earlier pipes, that's not necessarily true. And if you have sites with a lot of Dutch influence in it, that's also not true. And I know we have Dutch pipes on the Isles of Shoals because the Dutch were trading with anyone, basically, they find. So it's imperfect, but in this case, it actually surprisingly matched up pretty well with what we knew from the history of the meeting house, which even in the historical records is kind of mentioned here and there, but nothing's really discussed about it.
When you compared it to the later meeting house on the other island, did you see some temporal artifactual changes, or was it just strictly the historical record that sort of said, here it starts?
Well, we know that most of the historical records, and even the meeting house I showed that's on Star Island, I think that's actually the second or third structure that stood on that site. And as far as I'm aware, there hasn't actually been that much archaeology on Star Island itself, because it's one of the islands that's privately owned. And we only had really permission to dig on Smuttynose Island and a little bit on Appledore Island, like Shoals Marine Lab campus.
Another question, in terms of meeting houses, is there like, did you notice like a size, like a square footage footprint that was similar, or is it more population driven? So if there's more people, it's a bigger building?
I don't know if there is any real significant factor. I did most of what the research I did on meeting houses, most of what I could find, which was really one really good volume, and then a bunch of scattered articles, a lot of which were so old that you had to really take what they're saying with a grain of salt. Kind of like the size of the meeting house was basically dependent on how big they wanted to build it. You know, obviously, if you have a larger community or you have a larger congregation, you want a larger meeting house, but it wasn't necessarily the case. It didn't. And in terms of this Smuttynose structure, I have no idea what its actual size was. We don't actually have a foundation or anything. We have kind of just like this vague collection of architectural artifacts with a collection of 17th century ceramics that go with it. Nothing really beyond that. And again, like I said, it was originally identified as a tavern. A colleague of mine, Megan Victor, Queens College or something like that in New York. It's been a while since I talked to her. Ran with the tavern saying, oh, look at this. And as I'm doing more and more historical research, I'm saying, but why would they have a tavern if they're not allowed to sell alcohol? And then when I found Edmund Pickard's deed where it says my flake rooms at the meeting house, or here right next to the meeting house, I'm like, oh, this is an interesting possibility. And that's when I started chasing down more of the leads.
Well, so if you look at the other structures in the Isles of Shoals buildings that are contemporary, do any of them have real foundations? Or are they typically like corner and something?
There's no real contemporary structures left on the Isles of Shoals. Anything that they've been torn down and rebuilt, and the ground's been landscaped, and it's hard to say for sure. Most of the structures that in the 17th century were probably post and ground or sill on grade construction, because that was just the most common way of doing it. We do have evidence that they may have been trying to level out certain areas, but it also could have been a storm surge from 1634. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's more likely to be a storm surge because we have towards the water really thick deposits that kind of peter out as you get further into the island. And it looks like sand from the local area. So
It's codfish in the Atlantic, and was it overfished the European side? That's like, so important. Was it right here? There's a strong.
no, there was and still is a strong cod fishery off of Norway. There's actually the actual first place where the English were fishing for cod was actually off of Ireland. It's just that as the European nations entered into this new colonial competition, they just looked further and further west in this case, until they found what to them were completely unfished, up for grabs virgin territory. And they initially ended up in Newfoundland because from Ireland to Newfoundland is almost a direct shot across the Atlantic, and it was only later that they came further south and found the Gulf of Maine. And again, despite what a lot of popular histories of the shoals will say, the Newfoundland fishery was actually far more important to the British than the New England fishery ever was. In part due to the seasonality of the fish, the Newfoundland fish arrived in market at a different time and could be traded for more valuable products. It seems like the New England fish was actually mostly being traded for wool and things like that, for alcohol or food products.
Do we have any questions from folks that are online? You can type things into the chat. Hey, John.
Yeah, Even in the archaeological work, did any post-colonial stuff show up?
No, Smuttynose Island has very poor soil development. Like you don't even really have a proper stratigraphy. With a few handful of exceptions where you get like the storm surge, and we also like deposit a shell that looks like it might have been used to like fill in a low area. Other than that, it's just a solid mass of black organic soil from top to bottom. When you get in under a microscope or you do flotation, you can start seeing minor differences, but in the field it was visually possible to distinguish between them. And there was no indication of most ones that I could see. But we also think that we think at one point we did hit the original surface of Smuttynose Island, but that was after going down some areas over a meter and some areas down 15 centimeters. We know the property is all the islands have been extensively landscaped in the 19th and early 20th centuries when they had the hotel operations up there.
Is one of your other things where there were shell middens there?
The only real shell midden we had was probably a European deposition entirely to build up the floor or the entryway to the building. We didn't find any like native shell middens or anything like that. And everything we found was crushed and looked like being crushed intentionally. It wasn't just like thrown on the ground and trodden on.
Will really soon try the beds closer to the islands because these flat areas, type of areas.
Most of the salt from into New England would have probably been imported from the Caribbean or from a European salt works. I know there was an attempt at the salt works in Fairland and Newfoundland that failed spectacularly to the point where the guy who set it up later wrote, "Don't even bother, it's not worth the effort." And I think there was some in possibly Connecticut or somewhere like that. It's been a while since I've looked at that research, so my memory is not quite as good as it used to be. But on the Isles of Shoals and in New England, I don't think there was too much active salt making.
I think when the Cape was a little later, wouldn't have been contemporary with these.
Yeah. And from what I've been able to see, that salt was considered such a relatively cheap commodity you could buy in bulk that it wasn't worth the effort to try to set up your own salt works. You could just import it, by the ton, literally.
So, codfish wool connection, is that
Codfish.
codfish and wool?
Well, we know that a lot of codfish, especially the winter caught codfish that went to the Iberian peninsulas like Spain and Portugal, arrived at market in time that the wool that was coming in from the sheep and the kind of the interior of those countries was also coming to market. So basically, the merchants would be selling the codfish, and then they'd be buying the wool, which they would then take back to England to feed the textile industries in England. Yeah, and then from after they sold the wool in England, they'd buy other products, which they would then take back to the colonies and sell to the colonists.
Do you know if there's been any attempt to core and then date the cores of the soil profiles? And we do a lot underwater where they'll actually go date the soil levels as opposed to.
Yeah, I'm not that I'm aware of. I don't know if Nate Hamilton ever did any coring out there. I think there was talk about doing it in it's now called Haley's Cove, which is the enclosed area formed by the breakwater that connects Malaga and Smuttynose, and then the old stone pier on Smuttynose. But I don't know if that ever happened. I don't think it happened in the years I was out there.
There's no evidence for sort of an earlier European use like Basque or other Europeans coming over to use it for fishing, like you would find as you go further up towards Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, like I said, the oldest European artifact that I can confirm on the islands was a 1610 period smoking pipe bowl, which could have been a little bit later, could have been an older one that was shipped over or something that maybe a seller had been carrying around for good luck and just happened to lose on the islands. But there's we did find a French coin on the islands, but honestly, back then you used whatever coins you get a hold of, because most of them are made of precious metals anyway, so they're worth whatever the value of that precious metal was. And even then, like the currency most often seen in the codfish trade was actually the Spanish real, the piece of 8, because most of the codfish was going to the Iberian Peninsula, was being sold in Spanish markets. So you'd have these weird situations where you'd be reading accounts like, oh yeah, I gave them 20 quintals of good fish worth 32 reals, a quintal. And then I gave them 11 quintals of refuse fish, which was only worth 12 shillings. And then I have to go through and try to convert that to figure out how much he was actually selling them, because then all the accounts are always kept in shillings, because that was the actual domestic currency.
When it becomes a resort area, like 19th century, did they import topsoil or anything soil like this? They could expand gardens, vegetables, flowers, all that kind of thing?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I haven't looked too much into that time period. There are stories that the islands have been stripped bare to rock at some point in the 18th or 19th century as people were peeling up peat to burn.
Oh,
So it's a possibility, but I'm not sure.
so what we see today is not the original.
No,
Nice.
I mean, it's at least 300 years of development. Like I said, I think in some of the deeper holes, we did find the original, like small amounts of the original surface level. And that's where we'd find like the prehistoric artifacts. But other than that, most of it is, deposition through the historic period.
Well, I guess, if there are no other questions, if there's no chat, and then I guess, we can, end the lecture, and thank you again. And remind people in the audience that we're meeting again on December 13th. And that'll be, I think, Naomi Ritterford. So with that, thank you all out there in Fiji land. So we'll be in touch. Thank you. Really appreciate you coming over tonight and giving this lecture.
Victor, the next December 13th will be here,
Yes,
and then December 3rd in meetings.
that's down in Middleborough. That's the society annual meeting is in Middleborough.
And what time is that?
That starts at 10:30. The lecture would be at 11.